It's time to travel back in the 80s and go to Hawkins, Indiana for Season 3 of Stranger Things, which starts out 3 months before Season 2 starts out. It starts out on June 28th, 1984, exactly 3 months before Season 2, and you have a bunch of military officials in a lab. They're trying to open up a portal to the Upside Down, and they get really, really close until the machine they're using blows up. When this happens, the commander flips out. The issue is he's doing it in Russian. And it becomes obvious, oh shit, these are the Russians. The very Russians which Dr. Owens warned us about in Season 2. The commander ends up choking out one of the guys and telling another scientist, you have 1 year to figure this out. So we'll fast forward to 1 year, which in the timeline is about 8 months after Season 2 ended. Most of the kids are headed to the brand new mall in town, which by the way has decimated downtown Hawkins. But you've got 11, Mike, Lucas, Max, and Will heading to the movies. They're able to sneak into George Romero's Day of the Dead through the back channels of the mall thanks to Steve Harrington, who lets them in through the ice cream shop that he's working at. And shortly after the movie starts, there is a massive citywide power outage. Unbeknownst to everybody in Hawkins, there is an abandoned steel warehouse, and the dirt around the warehouse starts to rise, kind of like in Season 2 when they took the soil samples. Now, the power outage doesn't last more than a couple seconds, and when it comes back, everybody in the movie theater cheers, but Will gets that uneasy feeling that he gets around the Upside Down. He doesn't go into the Upside Down, but he just gets that weird, eerie feeling. Now, one of the people that wasn't at the movies was Dustin, who was at a month-long science camp, and he's having trouble getting in touch with his friends. His mom says, well, maybe they forgot about you, which puts the fear of God into Dustin, but when he gets home, all of these robotic toys start moving around on their own, and the friends surprise him back at his house. So after they exchange pleasantries, Dustin starts showing the guys what he made at science camp, including a couple cool things. But the big thing is a radio to talk to his girlfriend named Susie with a Z. Apparently she's hotter than Phoebe Cates. Everybody calls bullshit on that. But Dustin has them trek all the way up to this huge mountain in the middle of the summer to set up this radio so they can talk to his girlfriend. So the whole gang starts trekking up this hill, and Mike and 11 decide, yeah, that's not really for us. So they make up an excuse of curfew, and it's 4 p.m. It's not curfew. And they head out. And Dustin kind of looks perplexed, and the entire group says this has been this way all summer. They're just going to make out. And this issue is a problem with Hopper. They spent the entire summer making out, and as a father now, he doesn't know how to handle this. So he heads to the one person he thinks he can give him good advice, Joyce Byers, who is working in the same shop she always works at, but at this point, since it's in downtown Hawkins, everything's like 75% off. So Joyce gives him really good advice and says, look, you don't like the relationship, just talk to them. Don't necessarily be their friend, but also don't be a cop, because if you come at them like a cop, they're going to rebel. It's just natural. So Hopper tries that, but the kids kind of are snarky about it, so he says, you need to get home, Mike. There's something wrong with your grandmother. And Mike starts freaking out, saying, what's wrong with Nana? And when they get in the car, he goes, there's nothing wrong with your grandmother, but you need to start respecting me or you're not going to see my daughter anymore. And he puts the fear of God into Mike. Now, Mike isn't the only Wheeler that's having a tough time, because Nancy is also having a tough time. She secured an internship along with Jonathan at the Hawkins Post, but Jonathan's being treated normal. Nancy's being treated like a grunt, having to take food orders and not really being respected. While there one night, she gets a phone call from the tip line about all these diseased rats around town. And it's a story that she might pursue, because she tried to pitch to them, small town America dying off because of the mall, and they just kind of laughed at her about the food orders. So it's really the first lead she's been able to get, and it's a good lead, because all throughout the town, these rats have been flocking to that abandoned steel mill, and they've been going to the basement and literally just exploding. But let's get back to Dustin, who is finally able, with the help of his friends, to set up this massive radio tower to talk to his girlfriend, Susie, who lives in Utah. And this is going to shock you, but a radio length from Utah to Indiana didn't really work out. And of course, he can't get a hold of her. The friends start even wondering if she's even real, and they bounce. Will, being a good friend, says, hey, maybe tomorrow we can just do something fun and play Dungeons and Dragons, but he also leaves. And when everybody leaves, all of a sudden, Dustin picks up a radio transmission in Russian. And they're basically on the radio just saying code words, but it's a year later, and they've seemingly made a lot of progress in opening up this portal. Now, also on that same night, you have Mrs. Wheeler, who is about to go cheat on her husband with Billy, Max's half-brother. She's having second thoughts because she sees her family there, but, Billy he's looking good at the pool. And Billy's already on his way to the Motel 6. When all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this thing hits his windshield, and he ends up crashing his car right in front of that steel mill. When he gets out, he gets attacked and dragged into the steel mill, and that's exactly where episode 2 picks up. where Billy has somehow made it out of the warehouse and gotten in his car and driven and found a payphone and immediately calls the cops. But when he does this, he gets put in the upside down. Now, Billy doesn't realize it's the upside down, but he's obviously very confused, and he sees a large group of people walking towards him. He starts yelling at them, "What do you want?" But as they get closer, their leader is Billy. In a series of flashbacks, you come to find out that Billy was engulfed by the shadow monster Demogorgon type, much like Will in season 2. We'll get back to him in a second, but a lot of this episode is focused on the mall. Talking in the mall, outside the mall, around the mall, everything about the mall. 11 is waiting for Mike to come over, but he never does. And when she calls him up and asks him what's up, he makes up a terrible excuse. He's obviously lying, and she knows this. Mike still has the fear of God in him from Hopper in the previous episode, so he doesn't really know how to handle this situation. And neither does 11, who heads over to Max's house to get some boy advice. Where Max tells her he's lying, he's a piece of shit, he keeps treating you like shit, you need to wake him up or dump his ass. She reveals that she's dumped Lucas 5 times already. After this little pep talk, they head to the mall, where 11 has never been before. I did make an error in the previous episode. She wasn't at the movies, so she's never been to the mall. She's never been clothes shopping, and Max says, hey, you need to go and find something for you. Not for Hopper, not for Mike, but just for you. Unbeknownst to them, Lucas, Will, and Mike are also at the mall, but they're trying to find a present that Mike can buy 11 as like an I'm sorry. This trip ends up being unsuccessful, as Mike only has like $3, but as they're all leaving the mall, they end up getting caught by Max and 11. 11 confronts Mike, who is handling this whole situation very awkwardly again and continues to lie about his Nana. To which 11 responds that, you lie, and I dump your ass. And then she storms on the bus with Max, leaving Mike in complete shock and disarray. And poor Will, by the way, because all this kid wants to do is play Dungeons and Dragons. But his timing is obviously terrible. Now, unbeknownst to Max and 11 and Will and Mike and Lucas, Dustin is also at the mall. Having felt ditched by his friends the previous day, he goes to see his latest friend, Steve Harrington. And Steve is pumped to see Dustin. It's kind of adorable. As they share some ice cream together, they talk about how they're spending each other's summers, and then Dustin says he needs some help with a secret mission. He reveals that he's intercepted a secret Russian message and he needs help decoding it. And just a reminder, this isn't like the heart of the 80s where like Red Army and whole Red Scare factor, so they're trying to keep this hush-hush. They don't do a good job of though because Dustin is loud as hell. So Steve and Dustin head into the back of the ice cream place and start trying to decode this message. While they're doing this, the other worker at the place, a girl named Robin, who's always giving Steve a hard time, she says that she can help decode this message because she speaks 4 languages. Now, it's worth noting she does not speak Russian, but usually when you learn one language, it helps learn 2 and learn 3 and all that. So with the help of Robin, they all start trying to decode this message as Steve is pushed to the front of the store to actually work. Now, we'll get back to the decoding situation in a minute. I want to talk about Nancy real quick, who is taking it upon herself to follow up on this lead that she got the previous night regarding the diseased rats. She makes up a poor excuse for her boss that she has to leave. She grabs Jonathan and they head over to the woman's house who made the call. The woman takes them down to the basement and she says, I bought this huge bag of fertilizer and you have rats, little teeth marks around, and they've been eating the fertilizer. And, I think they have rabies and I think the town needs to know about this. And while she's telling the story, you hear a clamoring in the background. She says, oh yeah, I caught one of them. And sure enough, there's a rat in a cage. Shout out to Billy Corgan, who is just thrashing about going nuts. Nancy heads upstairs to follow up on some of the leads. She calls the supply company where they got the fertilizer. She calls an exterminator. And while she's doing that, Jonathan is taking pictures of the rat. But all of a sudden, it just kind of keels over and it looks like it's convulsing. Nancy runs downstairs and says, Jonathan, I got to leave. We got to go. And as they leave, the rat blows up. But the remnants of the rat end up becoming something that slithers out of the cage, and it looks a lot like a slime version of Dart. Now, after the whole 11 and Mike debacle, Hopper ends up heading to Joyce's store to kind of have a mini celebration. And in the process, he asks her out on a date. He says it's not a date. It's clearly a date. As he's leaving the store, he trips over some magnets, and Joyce ends up noticing these because she had magnets fall off of her fridge in the previous episode. She's pretty curious as to why magnets aren't sticking to metal objects, so she heads to the one person that she knows would know the answer, the science teacher. The science teacher ends up explaining to her that, look, it might just be a fluke. You might be looking at patterns that aren't even there. And the fact is, you would need a $1,000,000 object to throw the magnetic field off of its kilter because your house and the store's house are at a pretty big distance. But in the process of finding out what's going on with the magnets, she ends up standing up Hopper. And Hopper's had a little bit of a rough day after such a great start for him with the whole 11 situation. He gets called to City Hall where there are protests for the mayor's job regarding the mall and it essentially killing the downtown area of Hawkins. He enters the meeting with the mayor saying, I'm not dispersing this mob. They're executing their constitutional right. But the mayor's kind of a scumbag and says, yeah, but they didn't get a permit, so get rid of them. Hopper throws his 2 cents in saying, look, if it's not for nothing, I don't think this is smart with your whole re-election campaign. And the mayor brings up that it's a few days away from July 4th, and he's planning on throwing this town the biggest bash they've ever seen, and that's all that the voters are going to care about. So Hopper has to reluctantly get rid of the mob that he didn't want to get rid of in the first place, and then he gets stood up for dinner. But let's finally get back to the decoding. With the help of Robin, Dustin and Steve have completely decoded the message, and it's mostly gibberish, but it's a code, obviously. They're not going to come right out and say, we're dropping the nukes. As they're trying to figure out what exactly the message means, they pass a carousel in the mall, and Steve Harrington goes, quick, give me a quarter. He puts the quarter in the carousel, and he ends up hearing the song that's played with the carousel, and he says, listen to the music. The music from the carousel is the same music you can hear on the Russian tape. And Steve says, I don't think this was coming from Russia. I think it was coming from here in Hawkins. And then finally, there is Billy, who has somehow made it back to the pool, but is obviously not acting like himself. Mrs. Wheeler comes up and apologizes to him for, ditching him. And he just turns around and says, just leave me alone. When he finally makes it to his lifeguard stand, he ends up burning up, like literally blistering up. So he hops off and staggers back to the showers. But you can see that the Demogorgon is growing in him a lot like it was growing in Will in the previous season. The female lifeguard comes to check on him, but he ends up choking her out, bringing her to the abandoned steel mill and basically sacrificing her to the whatever the hell has become of all these dead rats. And now we will move on to episode 3, where Max and 11 are celebrating their mini victory, but they're curious as to what the guys are going through, and luckily for them, 11 can do that. So she goes in that sunken place, and you've got Lucas and Mike is just repeatedly saying, I don't know what I did to deserve this. But then they get the idea of doing this with other people. So they bring up a board and they play kind of a spin the bottle game, and the bottle lands on Billy. But when 11 goes into the sunken place, Billy's there, but Billy turns around and sees her. It's a lot like how her mother saw her in the second season. This gives 11 a really uneasy feeling, and she's no longer focused on Mike. They go over to Max's house and they find a bathtub full of empty ice bags and also some lifeguard paraphernalia with blood all over it. So they continue this True Detective mission and they head over to the pool where the manager tells them, yeah, it's this girl Heather's and you can't give it to her because she flaked on me and she didn't show up for work today. So they grab a picture of Heather off the board, head to the bathroom, turn on all the showers so it kind of sounds like static noise. And 11 once again goes in the sunken place to find where Heather is. She finds her, and she's in a bathtub screaming for help, but all of a sudden she sinks deep, and 11 can't reach her, and she just disappears. But we'll get back to them in a minute, because Nancy's also dealing with an issue. She's not being respected at work. She ends up bringing the rat story to her boss in front of all the other writers at the Post, and they completely laugh her off. Her boss tells her, look, next time you get a tip, do your job that you were hired for, give it to us, and we'll figure out if it's a story. But Nancy's not taking no for an answer. With a little convincing, she grabs Jonathan and heads back to the old woman's house, but no one's answering the door. Jonathan says, look, she might not be home, but Nancy goes, she's 80 years old and it's pouring rain out. Where else would she be? So Nancy lets herself in, and they head downstairs in the basement where they hear another clamoring, and they look over, and the old woman is just housing fertilizer, having clearly been eaten by whatever the remnants of the rat were. So she's been completely taken over, but has she been completely taken over by the Russians? And a couple people that are trying to find that out are Steve Harrington, Dustin, and Robin. Now, Robin's actually the one that has a chance to figure this out, while Steve Harrington and Dustin just scope out the mall for potential quote-unquote Russian hacks. But Robin does have a eureka moment with a delivery man when he shows up and he's got a silver cat. One of the code words was silver cat. And she cracks the code that there are deliveries to certain stores in the mall that are linked with this Russian communication. So that night they head to the roof of the mall and they're scoping it out. And sure enough, like there are guys with machine guns guarding the doors as deliveries get made. That's kind of weird for a mall situation. And on top of it, they're speaking Russian. We also get the first hints of a relationship between Robin and Steve that, of course, will eventually come to fruition. But while that relationship is at its infancy stage, another relationship that's at its infancy stage but hasn't taken off yet is Hopper and Joyce. And Joyce heads over to Hopper's house to tell him about the magnets, but Hopper is incensed that he was stood up. He can't focus on anything Joyce is saying because of the fact that she ditched him last night. So when she's explaining to him about the magnets and about the science teacher explaining to her about this multi-billion-dollar resource that would have caused this effect, all Joyce can think about is it's them. It's the people from the lab. So she grabs bolt cutters and heads over to the lab, and Hopper has no choice but to follow her. So they break into the lab, and while they're walking around, an old security camera turns on and starts following them. Of course, when they get down to the basement of the lab, they find nothing other than the remnants of what happened. And Hopper tells her, look, I saw this thing be closed up. You have nothing to worry about. He also reveals that he's aware that she's trying to sell her house and move out of Hawkins. And he says, look, I've tried my best to make this town safe, and he gives her a mini pep talk on why she should stay in the town. But while he's doing this, they hear a noise in another room, so Hopper goes to investigate it, where he's attacked. He puts up a pretty good fight, but the guy is just too much for him. And this guy is someone we saw leaving City Hall in episode 1. He was also in the restaurant where Hopper was at in episode 2. Not sure if he's following him or not, but he's definitely a pretty bad dude, and he doesn't leave Hopper dead, but he leaves him pretty messed up as he just takes off on his motorcycle. So it seems like this guy was tipped off by the security cameras. Now, 3 of the guys we haven't really brought up yet are Mike, Lucas, and Will. And Will is taking it upon himself to set up a game of Dungeons & Dragons, but neither Mike or Lucas really want to play because they were just dumped by their girlfriends. After repeatedly trying to get them involved in the campaign, he just loses it and says, you know what, I'm just going to go home. Mike apologizes repeatedly, but he says, you know what, you're ruining our party. Mike goes, how am I ruining the party? He goes, where's Dustin right now? You don't even know. See, you're so focused on swapping spit with this girl that you've completely ruined what was good about this party. And Mike responds with, it's not my fault you don't like girls. You can't expect us to just stay kids the whole time, man. We're going to grow up. We're going to have girlfriends. We're not just going to sit in the basement playing Dungeons & Dragons all day. So Will takes off, and Mike and Lucas eventually go after him. But Will heads to his hideaway in the woods where he's looking at old pictures of him and his friends dressed up as Ghostbusters for Halloween. And he remembers the good times of playing Dungeons & Dragons, and he completely just destroys his hideaway in a fit of rage. But after doing so, he gets that really uneasy, creepy feeling on the back of his neck. And at this point, Mike and Lucas have found him, and he turns around and he just says, he's back. And this is where we bring the episode all back together because it all has to do with Billy. So after the sunken place findings with Heather, Max and 11 head over to Heather's house, but they shockingly find Billy there, and he's acting really bizarre. He's eating dinner with Heather's parents. By the way, her dad is the editor at the Hawkins Post, so he's Nancy's boss. But he's being way too nice to Max. And the girls just ask, where is she? But she, being Heather, walks out of the kitchen holding a plate of cookies, so she looks like she's fine. Now, Eleven's still really socially awkward and doesn't know how to ask questions, so Max makes up an excuse and they leave, but they leave with an uneasy feeling. And as they're leaving, Billy is staring them down, and all of a sudden, he gets a flashback. But it's, of course, not Billy. It's the Demigorgon getting a flashback of 11, realizing, oh shit, she's the one who stopped me from coming through the portal last season. After a while, though, he goes back to the dinner with Heather's parents, and Heather's mom ends up collapsing from a cookie that was clearly, like, roofied. And when the dad goes to check on her, Heather ends up smashing him with a wine bottle as Billy puts a chloroform rag around him. So Billy continues to grow this Demigorgon army, and at this point you've got Heather, Heather's parents, and the old lady ready to take on Hawkins. So in episode 4, Max is trying to console 11 that Billy is fine, but 11 is not buying this at all. And she shouldn't, because while Max is doing this, Billy is busy feeding Heather's parents to the Mind Flayer. Now, real quick, I know I said earlier the Demigorgon, but my wife came in and said, you idiot, it's not the Demigorgon, it's the Mind Flayer. My bad. Mind Flayer, Demigorgon. At this point, if you're still following me, you know what I'm talking about. The Mind Flayer. So 11 has really good reason to be wary of Billy. We'll get back to 11 in a minute because the paramedics have arrived at the old woman's home, who is busy just chomping down on some delicious fertilizer. And one of the cops says to Nancy and Jonathan, what the hell is going on here? Because it's a very weird scene. Obviously, they've identified themselves from the Hawkins Post, so they have to tell the editor-in-chief from the Hawkins Post about the fact that they have 2 employees breaking into this old woman's home. And when the chief finds out about this, he flips out. Now, keep in mind, he has been taken over by the Mind Flayer, so he's not in the right state of mind, but he loses it, reams Nancy out, and in the process, fires them both. Jonathan drives Nancy home, and Nancy's going, look, this isn't a big deal. Your life's not over. It was just a summer internship, to which Jonathan gets really pissed off and says, this is your privilege right here talking. Like, you have two parents and, they have good jobs and I don't. Like, this was a big deal for me and I just blew it. Eventually, they end up kind of breaking up. They basically have an adorable teenage fight. But they don't leave on the best of terms. And Nancy's clearly upset. Later on that day, Mrs. Wheeler, clearly sensing that something's going on with Nancy, gives her a little pep talk and says how much of a fighter she is. And if the Hawkins Post wants to fire her over this story, but she truly thinks it's a story, then go find that story and sell it to a bigger paper and make the Hawkins Post pay. We'll get back to Nancy in a little bit because Hopper is kind of pissed off that he was attacked, understandably so. But he wakes up in his cabin and Joyce is standing there. And she has the plan of tracking this guy because she has some of his license plate. And Hopper says that's not going to be enough. To which Joyce responds with, well, it was a motorcycle. I don't know if that helps. And it does help. All of a sudden, Hopper remembers that there was a guy leaving the mayor's office that day who had a motorcycle helmet. So he barges into the mayor's office unannounced and starts demanding answers because he is not in the mood to talk. At first, the mayor tries to play hardball and doesn't want to give him any answers, but Hopper literally ragdolls him and at one point puts his finger through a cigar cutter, and finally the mayor starts talking. The mayor reveals that the guy who attacked Hopper was sent from Starcourt, the people that also built the mall. They want to buy up other properties around Hawkins, Indiana, and to do that, they're greasing the palms of the mayor. So this guy brings the mayor gifts from time to time, and the mayor makes it easy for Starcourt to expand their property. Hopper asks if he has proof of these transactions, and he says, yeah, but they're at my house. So doesn't give the mayor a choice, grabs them, and off they go to the house. And when they get there, the mayor does provide the deed of sale, and Hopper says, I find it kind of weird that you have these in your house. And the mayor goes, look, man, these are bad dudes. You don't want to mess with these people. While Joyce is looking around the properties that they've bought up, she realizes all the properties are around the power plant, and that would explain why there was a power outage, and thus her magnets were falling off her fridge. They end up leaving the mayor at his house chained up and beat up, and eventually the mayor's wife does come home, and he starts yelling, help get me a phone because he wants to alert the Russians that obviously Hopper and Joyce are onto him. So off Hopper and Joyce go, looking at the properties that Starcourt has bought, trying to get to the bottom of this. Now, three other people that are trying to get to the bottom of it are Robin, Steve, and Dustin. Dustin has continued to case the place and realizes there's only one way into that room, and that's through the front door that's guarded by people with guns. That's when Robin gets an idea and she grabs a bunch of cash in the tip jar, heads to City Hall, and buys up blueprints of the mall. She realizes, yeah, there's no door, but there are vents that you can climb through and get to that room. The problem is everybody's too big to fit in that vent. Everybody except Lucas's sister, Erica. Lucas's sister, by the way, is a straight savage. She makes them make the entire menu of Scoops Ahoy. And after they make it, that's when she says, what I want in return is ice cream for life. So shout out to Erica. She's able to get in the room with ease and she lets the other three in. And while they're looking through boxes that are supposed to go to a Chinese restaurant, there is some weird shit, including this random tube of just green stuff. Not stuff that you would find in a Chinese restaurant. All of a sudden, while they're inspecting this green tube, the room starts moving and it just shuts down. And it's not really a room, it's an elevator. And it quickly starts going down. Now let's get back to Eleven and Max, who have been contacted by Lucas, Mike, and Will, because they think Eleven can help after Will has revealed to them that he's back. So Will quickly fills the girls in, and the question they have is, we closed that portal. And Will says, yeah, but the thing that was in me, you guys forced it out by putting me in that hot box, and you might have closed him into this world. And in the process, you pissed him off, and he might be looking for another host. And that host obviously is Billy, so they all start spying on Billy at work, and he's there, but he's acting weird. He's completely covered up, and it's the dead of summer. And Max continues to make excuses for him, but his behavior is too weird to ignore. Just to make sure, though, they come up with the plan of trapping him into the sauna at night, because if you do, you'll see the mind flare start to creep out of him. So they wait until nighttime, and their plan works. They hook up a tape recorder to one of those CPR dummies, and they place it in the sauna, and they're goading him in by taunting him over and over, and he falls for it. He walks right in the sauna, and that's when Eleven closes it in. Pretty quickly, he gets uncomfortable and starts pleading to Max, who for some odd reason feels really bad for him, and she gets kind of close to the window. And when this happens, Will gets that really uneasy feeling, and that's when Mike yells, "Get away from the door." And it's a good tip because Billy has busted through the window of the door, not the door itself, but he's got a sharp object and he's out for blood. While this is going on, you're seeing the mind flare come out of him, confirming their original thoughts, and he starts smashing against the door that's chained up, and They're all like, there's no way he gets to that door, right? No way. But he does. He actually busts through the door. Now, when this happens, 11 uses her powers to pick up a barbell with a lot of weight and smash him against the wall. But amazingly, Billy is like stupid strong and actually throws it back at her. It knocks 11 down and Billy picks her up and starts choking her out. And that's when Mike comes to her defense and hits him with some metal object. He goes to hit him again, but Billy ends up catching the object. And now his intention is to Mike. Right before Billy can do really big damage to Mike, 11 uses her powers and throws Billy through a wall. And that's when Billy just completely takes off and runs away. 11 collapses into Mike's arms. She's completely traumatized, freaked out. She's got blood in her nose, and she's really upset. Billy ends up retreating back to the abandoned steel mill and tells Heather it was the same girl. She could have killed me, and Heather says, yeah, but she can't kill all of us. And there's literally an army of people down in the basement of this abandoned steel mill, along with the mind flare. Now, one of those people that isn't there but is taken over by the mind flare is that old woman who's in a hospital. Nancy has taken her mother's advice and gone to the hospital to continue the investigation. When all that stuff was happening with Billy, it looked like it was happening with the old woman. You could see the mind flare creeping out of her. Her heart rate started racing, but yet nobody was attacking her. All right, on to episode 5. Episode 5 starts out with Robin, Dustin, Erica, and Steve stuck in this elevator, and they can't find a way out. They realize they need a key card to actually get out of it, but obviously they don't have one. Dustin brings up the fact, well, we can just use the elevator hatch and we'll just climb out that way. But when he does that, he realizes just how far underground they are. And we're talking stories down. They have to stay there the entire night, but in the morning they hear a noise, so they end up hiding. And that's when the Russians open up the elevator and start unpacking it. As they're about to leave, the elevator starts closing and Steve Harrington puts that green metal canister under it so they can sneak out. They're able to do so just in the nick of time, but the elevator ends up crushing it, and when it does, the green liquid ends up corroding the floor. So now they're stuck underground, and they look to see where they're going to go, but there's only one option, and it is a long tunnel down. So they start walking, but at some point, Steve Harrington pulls Dustin aside and asks him, do you think this could correlate with what happened last year? And Dustin says, I guess so. The girls end up pulling him back in, and eventually they keep walking, and they can hear the code words that tipped him off to the Russians being there. They realize they must be close to who's ever relaying this message, and if they're close, that means on the outside can hear them. The problem is, the main hub of this building is pretty crowded with Russian soldiers. They end up seeing the control room, and they are able to sneak in, but now they have to take out the guy who's relaying the message. Steve Harrington does that. Dustin congratulates him for finally winning a fight. They steal his key card, and they're about to leave, but Robin notices a flight of stairs and follows them up. And when she does this, she sees that mechanism that was trying to reopen the gate. Now, while they deal with those Russians, Joyce and Hopper are dealing with another pair of Russians. They've gone to another property that Starcourt has bought, and sure enough, in the basement, they do find two guys working on something. Hopper ends up trying to take them prisoner, but the guy who originally attacked Hopper shows up, and him and Hopper get into a fight. And to best describe this guy, he's like the Russian version of the Terminator. Hopper is able to take him out by grabbing a wrench and banging it against his knee, and him and Joyce are able to escape along with one of those Russians that was originally down there. But as they're escaping, the Russian Terminator litters their truck with bullets, so they're able to escape, but their truck is in desperate need of repair, and he's hot on their trail. They end up having to park it in the middle of the woods and just walking out, and Hopper says he knows somebody in Indiana who speaks Russian, and Joyce, being annoyed, pops back, so we're just gonna walk there? And he says, no, that's not the plan. Eventually they find a 7-Eleven, and Hopper commandeers a vehicle saying it's police business. And him, Joyce, and this Russian guy take off in the Todd father's vehicle. So Joyce, Hopper, and the Russian arrive at the guy who Hopper knew speaks Russian, and it turns out to be the investigative journalist from season 2. After he gives them a hard time about their names and what their business is, Joyce just reams him out, and it seems like he's going to help them figure out what this Russian was doing down in the basement. But 11 has no idea where Hopper is, so she goes in the sunken place to find him. All the other kids are talking about what the next move is, and that's when Nancy bursts through the door looking for Will. Jonathan and Nancy have come to the conclusion that this woman just didn't start eating fertilizer. It must be correlated with what happened last season. Mike explains that the mind flare probably took over Mrs. Driscoll, and that's when it dawns on them that if there's 2 of them, there's probably 4 and 8 and many more. 11 eventually brings up Heather, so they head over to her house. Nancy obviously knows that Tom is her dad, so that would explain the weird behavior that he was having the previous day. When they get to the house, they find the remnants of an attack scene. They also find a bunch of chemical products that were just torn apart the house. Max asks, Will, you weren't drinking chemical products last year, and he goes, No, but our science teacher did say if you mix two chemicals together, you get a different result. And obviously the mind flare is trying to do that. Jonathan says they must have been taken somewhere because nobody's in the house. And 11 says, well, it must be somewhere they don't want me to see. Nancy brings up the fact that Mrs. Driscoll kept saying, I have to go back. So we need to find out where exactly back is. And that's when Will says, look, if she wants to go back so bad, let her do it and it'll lead us right to them. All the kids end up heading to the hospital, but only 2 are allowed up for visitation. So Nancy and Jonathan head up, but Mrs. Driscoll isn't there. Who is there, however, is Tom and one of his douchey writers from the newspaper. Tom, the editor-in-chief of the Hawkins Post, has blood all over his hands and he starts stalking them down. Jonathan ends up getting taken out by the coworker, but Nancy is able to get away, and when this happens, the coworker ends up stalking Nancy. As Jonathan lays on the floor, Tom comes over to finish him off, but right before he's able to do it, he starts acting like he's in pain, and the reason is because Nancy is taking out the coworker. And it seems like once you hurt one of them, you're kind of hurting all of them. So Nancy and Jonathan both end up killing Tom and the other douchey reporter, but when this happens, their bodies end up turning into that liquid, and it ends up creeping down the hall and meeting up and forming the mind flare. Episode 6 starts out with Robin, Dustin, Erica, and Steve walking down, having just witnessed the machine trying to reopen up the Upside Down, and Steve and Dustin end up filling them in as to what that machine is exactly. But as they're walking down, they realize that the Russian that Steve took out is now alerting his comrades that there are intruders. So they quickly have to get the hell out of there. They start frantically running through a series of doors, and eventually Steve Harrington and Robin hold them off as Dustin and Erica get away, but the Russians do end up picking up Robin and Steve. Dustin and Erica now have to find a way out of the lab, but also they need to get Steve Harrington and Robin back. And those two are currently being interrogated by the head Russian commander. The Russians do not believe that they are just teenagers working in an ice cream shop, and they start to torture them, trying to get answers out of them. Eventually, Robin confides in Steve that she sat directly behind him in a class 2 days a week for an entire year, and he had no idea that she even existed. She even goes as far as to say she was obsessed with Steve Harrington, but he just had no idea who the hell she was. When the Russians get back into the room, they give them truth serum, and the answer still is, we're teenagers who work for Scoops Ahoy. But Robin does reveal that we cracked your code, you're not as smart as you think you are. 2 teenagers who work in the mall realize what you guys were doing here. Steve also lets them know who Dustin is and his home address, so they have all that information. Now, speaking of Dustin, he's located a bunch of that acid stuff that corroded the floor, and Erica has located a cattle prodder, and they're going to use these 2 items to try to free Steve and Robin. So as Steve and Robin are being interrogated, an alarm goes off, and when the Russians run out of the room, part of the hallway has been corroded. And that's when Dustin and Erica come in and free Steve and Robin. Now, before we get to the one Russian that got away, it's 4th of July and the mayor is getting ready to do that big party that he was throwing Hawkins. The issue that he has is that Terminator Russian guy has shown up, and he wants Jim Hopper's head. He gives the mayor 1 day to find Jim Hopper, and even though the mayor says, look, he can't be that hard to find, he's driving a yellow car for Christ's sake, the Russian Terminator does not want excuses, he wants results. And Hopper, of course, is at the investigative journalist's house trying to figure out how to get this Russian that they kidnapped to speak. After trying to play good cop with him and getting him Slurpees and food, Hopper has enough. He roughs him up a little bit and finally throws him out of the room and throws the keys at him and says, if you want to leave, leave. When he re-enters the house, the investigative journalist and Joyce are looking at him like, dude, are you nuts? He's just going to run off. And he goes, look, I know what this guy's going to do. He's going to realize that he has it better off with us because when he goes back to those Russians, they're going to assume that he talked anyway. So he's going to come back to us, and he's going to help us out. Now, at first, it doesn't look like that's going to happen as the guy ends up uncuffing himself, jumping into the car, and seemingly pulling away. But he does stop, backs the car up, and agrees to help them. And it plays out just like Hopper said. What he reveals is that all the houses they're buying up is stealing the power grid from the power plant to try to help the Russians get into the Upside Down. They tried it in Russia, but it didn't work. Because even though they have the machine to do it, location is another issue. And because the gate was already open in Hawkins, if they want to open the gate, that's exactly where they had to go. Now, initially, Joyce freaks out and wants to make sure her kids are okay. And after that, they call a hotline that Dr. Owens gave them. And it's a really weird hotline. It's a government-type situation where when they answer, they say, Philadelphia Public Library, and you have to use a code name and a password to get your message across. And they tell Dr. Owens, come to Hawkins, Indiana. The Russians are trying to open the gate. Bring as many people as you can. And Hopper hangs up. But Joyce is not going to wait around. She calls the guy back and reams him out like she's at a PTA meeting, telling him that he needs to get off his ass, go find Dr. Owens, and alert him to what's going on in Hawkins, Indiana. And then just hangs up. Real power move by Joyce. But the Russians aren't the only issue in Hawkins, because the Mind Flayer has trapped Nancy in a room, and it looks like the Mind Flayer is going to get Nancy, but at the last second, 11 busts through the door and literally throws it out of a window where it retreats down into the sewers. They all go back to Hopper's cabin, and 11 is trying to locate the base. She's trying to locate Heather, her dad, Billy, the whole gang, but she's having problems. While all this is going on, Mike gets worried about her because she's never done this for this long of a period of time. Max ends up sticking up for 11, saying, look, she knows her limitations. You don't have to speak for her. This fight results in Mike admitting that he doesn't want to lose her and that he loves 11. Just after he says this, 11 walks out and says, I think I found them. So 11's idea is to do what she did with her mother. Go into the sunken place and literally touch Billy and try to get some kind of message. Mike says, keep in mind, your mother wanted you to see, and Billy might not. So this could be a dangerous plan. But 11 goes through it anyway. When she touches Billy in the upside down, Billy grabs her. And when she goes to get her hand back, she ends up tripping into a memory of Billy as a kid as he surfs with his mother on the beach. Billy's having a great time. He looks happy. But the memory gets darker and darker and darker. You find out that Billy's mom literally abandoned him with his abusive father. She couldn't take the abuse anymore and just left the family. This really is the heart of the issue with Billy and why he's so angry all the time. It caused Billy to fight as a kid and just be an overall dick. But during this memory, she is able to figure out that the steel mill is where they are located. 11 thinks she's out of the sunken place, but none of her friends are in the basement. And that's when Billy shows up. He says, you opened this up, you let us in, and now you're going to be forced to let us stay. And now we're all coming for you, and we're going to take over you, and then we're going to take over your friends, and then we're going to take over everybody. And when Billy says this, you see all these people in Hawkins just walking towards the abandoned steel mill in like a vegetative state. They start forming a line, single file, to the basement of the steel mill, and literally start getting absorbed by the Mind Flayer. With each person, the Mind Flayer grows and gets bigger. So the Mind Flayer is ready to bust out and attack Hawkins. Eventually, 11 does end up coming out of it, and she is once again crying in Mike's arms. In episode 7, all the kids are in Hopper's cabin trying to make sense of everything, and they come to the conclusion that Billy has built an army solely to defeat 11. With the fireworks going off from the 4th of July, they hear a noise outside that doesn't sound like fireworks, so they travel outside of the cabin, and that's when they see the Mind Flayer standing there. They start grabbing weapons to hunker down and just wait for him to attack. They don't have to wait long because it busts through and goes right after 11, but Jonathan starts hacking away at it with an axe. That's when it goes after Jonathan, so Nancy starts shooting it with a shotgun. Then it tries to go after Nancy, and that's when Elle uses her powers to kind of destroy the one arm of it. But another arm pops through, and another arm pops through, and she's trying to hold them off as long as she can. She's able to take both of them out, but when she lets her guard down for a split second, the Mind Flayer busts through the ceiling and grabs her. The kids act quick, however, and start trying to pull her back in, but the Mind Flayer's got a pretty tight grip on her leg. That's when Lucas grabs the axe and starts trying to hack away at it. After a few whacks, Ella's set free, and that's when she snaps, literally tearing it in half. Now, the Mind Flayer isn't dead, but it is injured, and so is Elle, who drops to the floor because her leg is pretty messed up. So the kids head to a pharmacy to get her patched up, but we'll get back to them in a little bit. Because you've got Erica, Steve, Robin, and Dustin, who are finally able to escape thanks to the key card. But as soon as they get out of the mall, there are guards looking for them, so they have to retreat back into the mall. Dustin ends up sneaking them into a screening of Back to the Future. He sits a still drugged Robin and Steve in 2 seats, and far down the same aisle, he sticks Erica and says, look, keep an eye on them. I'm going to try to go get help to get out of here. So Dustin heads up to the highest place in the mall, the projector room, and starts trying to radio his friends for help. His friends have now arrived at the pharmacy to try to get 11 all patched up. Unfortunately for them, pharmacies aren't like today where they're open 24/7, so they just had to break in. So Max, having dealt with a lot of injuries herself skateboarding, is tasked with healing up 11, and the rest of the group kind of just walks around the pharmacy trying to make sense of this all and also trying to formulate a plan, but they realize they really need 11. But Lucas, however, has a great plan because they have a killer fireworks display, and he finds one really, really big firework, and he says, if you have like 5 of these things, it's basically a stick of dynamite. Now, Max just laughs this plan off because she doesn't think it's a serious plan, but she'll learn. You've also got Mike trying to tell 11 that he loves her in the most awkward way possible, and when he kind of gets to that point, that's when he hears the radio go off from Dustin saying it's a code red. Now, the issue is you can't really understand Dustin on the radio because he's running out of batteries. So he's trying to alert his friends of the issues with the Russians and infiltrated Hawkins, but they can't understand him. So he runs back down to Erica, who's sitting in the movies, and asks, hey, do you have batteries? And she's like, no, why would I have batteries? He goes, I always have batteries. She goes, well, then what's the problem? He goes, I don't have enough of them, and they can't hear us. But he's got a bigger issue because Steve and Robin have just disappeared, and they're walking around the mall, and all of a sudden they start tripping out and realize, we should probably try throwing up these drugs. They rush to the bathroom and throw them up and then have a test to see if they're still under the influence of truth serum. Robin asks Steve, hey, have you ever been in love? And he says, yeah, Nancy Wheeler. She asks, are you still in love with her? And he says, no, now I've got a new girl. And he starts describing Robin in great detail, but there's a slight issue. Robin's gay. She was obsessed with Steve Harrington because Steve Harrington was the desire of a girl in that class who Robin had a crush on. Shortly after this, Dustin arrives, pretty pissed off that they left, and says, let's go. The movie's letting out. We'll just blend in with that crowd. Now, lucky for them, Mike did not give up just because he couldn't understand Dustin. 11 used their powers to realize they're at the mall. So they all head to the mall to help out Dustin with whatever thing he needs help with. All they knew was it was a code red. And shortly after they leave the pharmacy, Billy shows up. So Billy is on their trail. It is worth mentioning that at one point, Billy looks down at the bloody rags that were used to patch up 11, and they start moving in that slime-like way from the mind flare. So this wasn't just like a normal bite. Now, one group that we haven't talked about yet is Joyce, Hopper, the investigative journalist, and their Russian friend Alexei/Smirnov. They're driving back to Hawkins, praying to God that the government meets them there. And Joyce and Hopper start bickering, and they've been bickering since Joyce stood him up for that date. And finally, the investigative journalist says, all right, this was cute at first, but enough. You guys just need to have sex. They laugh that off, but everybody in the car knows, yeah, it's probably true. Luckily, the awkwardness doesn't last too long in that car because they do end up arriving back in Hawkins, where everyone's basically at that 4th of July fair. They head to the fair looking for their kids, but they don't find their kids. It's kind of the other way around. They've been found. The mayor sees Joyce and Hopper walking around, and he alerts that Russian Terminator guy. Hey, I found him. So Hopper and Joyce are walking around, and Alexei and the investigative journalist are kind of just standing there, and Alexei says, hey, so after I help you guys, I get citizenship, and then I can enjoy the fun, right? And the investigative journalist says, man, we can enjoy the fun right now. He gets him some game tickets, and the investigative journalist heads off to get some food. And Alexei does well at these carnival games. He ends up winning a prize, but as he's walking back and he shows the investigative journalist from a distance, hey, look what I won, the Russian Terminator comes out of nowhere and shoots him with a silencer and just keeps walking. The investigative journalist saw this all go down, so he rushes to grab Alexei and then also rushes to find Hopper and Joyce to let them know they got Alexei. Hopper ends up eluding the Russians, sneaking into a fun house. He takes a few of them out, grabs one of their guns, and ends up shooting the Russian Terminator guy. Unfortunately for Hopper, the Russian Terminator guy was wearing a bulletproof vest, so while he's injured, he's not dead. And Joyce, the investigative journalist, and Hopper are able to escape, but unfortunately, they did lose Alexei. Luckily, however, he did alert them how to turn off the machine, exactly where they need to go and all the details. So his death was not in vain. Hopper was also able to grab a radio from one of the Russians, so they're listening to the communication, and they hear them say, we found the kids in the mall. They don't know which kids, but they're heading to the mall because they assume it's got to be our kids. And they would be right. Kind of. Erica, Dustin, Steve, and Robin were trapped in the mall, and they're basically surrounded by these Russians who caught them trying to leave the movie theater, and at this point, they have nowhere to go. That is until all of a sudden, one of the display cars you tend to see in some malls sometimes starts beeping and then gets picked up and thrown and takes out all of the soldiers. And then you look up and 11 and the rest of the group have arrived to save them. Both groups end up meeting in the middle and exchanging pleasantries. Oh, we were doing this. Oh, you guys are doing that. That's cool. But all of a sudden, 11 just collapses to the ground because her leg is really messed up. And when I say messed up, there's something moving in there. So the mind flare is basically in 11. And finally, we get to the season finale, episode 8. Joyce, Hopper, and the investigative journalists are racing to the mall after the radio frequency, and they have good reason to because 11 is in extreme pain, and her leg, as I said, is literally moving. It's got something in it. So Jonathan goes, grabs a knife, and grabs something for her to bite down with, and starts to try to cut out the mind flare's sluggish-like thing, but he's unable to do it. So finally, 11 uses her powers to literally rip it out of her body. She grabs it, throws it on the ground, and that's when Hopper steps on it because they've arrived. Now the adults and the kids, they're all trying to formulate a plan, and Dustin wants to help because they've actually been down in the Russian tunnel, but Hopper isn't having it. So Dustin says, all right, I'll tell you what. We've been down there. We'll go to the highest level of Hawkins where there's a giant radio that somebody might have built, i.e. me, and we'll radio you guys directions on where you should go. It's probably the best plan that Hopper's going to hear, so he agrees to it, and Joyce tries to send the other kids home in her car. So Erica, Robin, Steve, and Dustin head up to the mountain to help out the adults, while Will, 11, Mike, Lucas, Max, Nancy, Jonathan they're all supposed to head home. The adults are then going to go down into the tunnel and try to blow up this thing. The problem is, when Nancy and Jonathan go to start up Mrs. Byers' car, it doesn't work. So Jonathan says, hey, pop the trunk, and they're missing a cable, and that's when Billy turns his lights on. Billy has been waiting in the parking lot, and he obviously took the cable out of the car. So that's when everybody flees back into the mall. But keep in mind, if Billy knows they're there, then the Mind Flayer also knows they're there. Now, while all this is going on, Joyce, Hopper, and the investigative journalist have made their way down to the Russian base under the mall. They've had to kill some Russians, but they did steal their uniforms, so they're trying to blend in. They're able to make it to the control room where the investigative journalist has to navigate the tunnels underneath the floor. And this is what Dustin and Erica were saying, hey, we can do, but they didn't want them to do. So Dustin and Erica now have to tell him left to right, go forward, all that, give him directions. And Dustin has made it to the top of the hill to his radio, so he's ready to help them out. But the group that was supposed to go home now doesn't know what to do because they're stuck in the mall, Billy's outside, and they need to get home. Jonathan says, hey, we can use that car that 11 threw. We don't need the actual car. We just need the ignition cable from it. But they have to tilt the car over, and 11 says, well, I got this. So she tries to tilt the car over. The problem is she has lost her powers. It seems like that slug-like thing that was in her body stripped her of all of her abilities. All of a sudden, the Mind Flayer shows up at the mall and starts attacking them. Now, high up on the hill, Dustin and his group can see this happening, and that's when Steve Harrington says, I gotta go help them get out of there. So him and Robin grab the Toddfather car and head back to the mall to see if they can help, while Erica and Dustin stick behind and keep navigating for the investigative journalist. Now, the group back at the mall has been split up a little bit. Both parties are trying to get out of there, and they both go through different exits to do so. So you've got Max, Mike, and 11 in one group, and then in the other group, you've got Lucas, Will, Nancy, and Jonathan. The group led by Nancy and Jonathan make it back to the car, but it's still not starting up, and Billy has got them in his sights. Nancy has a gun and starts firing it at Billy, who is now driving his car head-on to try to hit the group of kids who are stranded. Right before he's able to hit the car, Steve Harrington comes out of nowhere and T-bones him and saves the day. Billy's car lights on fire as the kids retreat back to the mall. Now, we'll get back to them in a minute because Joyce, Hopper, and the investigative journalist have an issue in that the Russian Terminator has arrived and he's now hunting them down. But Joyce and Hopper don't know that at the time, and they don't have anything to do until the investigative journalist reaches the control room. So they're chit-chatting, and they agree that even though they've bickered a lot, they make a pretty good team, and they agree to reschedule their date, and they even call it a date. And with the help of Dustin and Erica, the investigative journalist has made it to the control room, so he does his part. So now it's on Joyce and Hopper who have to get the key out of a safe. They start putting in the number combination that Alexei gave them, but the number combination doesn't work. They try it a few times, and then they radio the investigative journalist, and apparently this combination is a famous number sequence that the investigative journalist thought he knew, but it turns out he doesn't. And neither does Dustin. And neither does Erica, but there is one person that might know it, and that's Susie. So Dustin ends up radioing Susie in. To everyone's surprise, she's alive, she's real, and she answers the call. Now, Susie's willing to give him the code, but she makes him sing the Never-Ending Story song in a pretty embarrassing scene. But they do end up getting that code. And now they have the code, and they have everything they need to close the gate. But they should hurry, because Billy's made it out of his car, and he's hunting down Max, 11, and Mike. And he just flat out runs through them. Max pleads to him, trying to get the real Billy out of him, but it doesn't work. He throws her to the side. He throws Mike to the side. He knocks out 11, and he picks her up, and he goes to basically feed her to the Mind Flayer. But right before he's able to do this, Lucas's plan takes effect. And the whole group starts throwing every single firework they have at the Mind Flayer to either hurt him, distract him, both. While this is going on, 11 is also trying to get the real Billy out of him, but she is tapping into his memories and recounting that he was once happy with his mother, and she's going into great detail about this memory, and it actually works because Billy comes out of it a little bit, wakes up, and sacrifices himself to save 11, basically holding off the one arm of the Mind Flayer that's going after 11 when the group runs out of fireworks to throw at it. Now, while the group is battling the Mind Flayer in the mall, Dustin is pleading to the adults underground to close the gate. But the issue is, the Russian Terminator has shown up, and he's making life a living hell for Hopper. They end up going out of the control room and battling near the mechanism that's used to reopen the gate. And after back and forth, Hopper is able to get the best of him. He throws him into that machine. It kills him. It damages the machine. And it actually blocks Hopper in so that he can't get back into the control room. And Joyce, who's standing in the control room, realizes that if I turn these keys, it's going to kill Hopper. Hopper realizes that too, but he also knows about the greater good with this situation, so he nods at Joyce, and she turns the keys, and Hopper disintegrates. But it does destroy the machine that's used to open up the Upside Down. But it also kills the Mind Flayer in the process. So to quickly recap, Hopper's dead, Billy's dead, and the Mind Flayer is dead. Now, shortly after this happens, that's when Dr. Owens and the U.S. Army finally show up. Typical U.S. government. They take their sweet time. They never show up when you need them. I'm kidding, by the way, folks. But not really. I mean, it's kind of true. So then the show fast forwards 3 months into the future, so we're in October. The mayor has been taken down for being a corrupt mayor. Steve Harrington and Robin are trying to get a job at a video store because Scoops Ahoy is no longer there. Now, Robin gets the job right off the bat, but Steve knows nothing about movies, so the manager of the video store is like, yeah, I'm not hiring him. By the way, the manager is the same guy who was working in the arcade in season 2. So Robin takes him aside and goes, look, the amount of women that came into Scoops Ahoy just to see this guy, we had to get extra ice cream from Michigan driven in because we couldn't contain the crowds. The guy's like, all right, what do I care? She goes, well, he can't handle all of those women, so there's going to be a trickle-down effect, and that's why you should hire him. But the big issue is Joyce has decided to move. Jonathan, Will, and now 11, who she's taking care of, they're all moving out of Hawkins, Indiana. Everybody's helping them pack up. Jonathan and Nancy have a tearful goodbye. And while packing up one of Hopper's police uniforms, she finds the letter that he had written down when he was supposed to address 11 and Mike. He wrote down this beautiful, well-written letter. But the problem is, he never told it to 11 because if you remember, he got annoyed by their attitude and just said, yeah, your grandmom died. So Joyce ends up giving it to 11, and it's a really emotional scene about how Hopper's telling her, you know, he couldn't feel anything until she came into his life. There was a void there that she replaced. And he just misses the days where they would stay up late making like giant Eggo sandwiches and watching movies till they fell asleep, but she's getting older and he hates that about her. And he realizes that he can't stop it, but he just wishes that he could. It just shows you how much Hopper truly cared about 11. So everybody packs up, they leave, a lot of tears. They all agree to see each other in the holidays, and the Byers family, along with 11, is leaving Hawkins, Indiana. But that's not how Season 3 of Stranger Things ends, because Season 8 ends in Kamchatka, Russia, where in the depths of this prison, 2 guards go to a prison cell and they say, no, not the American. So they do have an American hostage, but they grab another guy. They take him down, throw him into a cell, and then they start turning a crank. And when they turn the crank, out pops a Demogorgon ready to attack. And that is how Season 3 of Stranger Things ends. All right, thanks everybody for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. And stay tuned for this in memoriam of all the people we lost in Season